What would have to happen for a man to seriously consider his horse worthy of becoming a senator? To demand to be called a god and execute people just for fun? There have been many cruel rulers in the history of ancient Rome, but the name Caligula still evokes special fear and bewilderment to this day. He went down in history as a tyrant emperor obsessed with power, madness, and the cult of his own personality. His reign was a mixture of shocking antics, bloody massacres, and outright absurdity. But behind it all is a tragic and almost unbearable truth. Caligula was not born a monster. He became one. His childhood is not just a sad chapter, it is the key to understanding his madness. The little boy in the golden sandals, whom the entire legionary camp called, affectionately, Caligula, after the name of the military boots. He looked like a favorite of fortune. Father, Germanicus, one of the most respected and beloved generals of Rome. Mother, Agrippina the Elder, from a powerful family. The people adored them. But all this beautiful picture came crashing down too soon. When Caligula was just 7 years old, his life became a nightmare. His father, Germanicus, was sent to Syria in 19 AD, where he suddenly fell ill and died. Rumors that he was poisoned on the orders of the Emperor Tiberius himself began to circulate almost immediately. Germanicus himself said to his wife as he was dying, "I've been murdered." He believed that this is revenge, for popularity, for the love of the people, because the people saw in Germanicus the future emperor, and not in aging and cruel Tiberius. After the death of Germanicus began a real persecution of his entire family. Agrippina accused Tiberius of killing her husband, for which she was later exiled to an island, where she died of starvation. Caligula's 2 older brothers died with her, Nero and Drusus. One died in exile, the other in prison, slowly starving to death like his mother. Imagine, a 7-year-old child is left as the sole surviving male in a family that is respected, feared, and hated. He grows up surrounded by traitors, political assassinations, conspiracies, and fear. And he doesn't just survive. He learns to keep quiet, to hide his feelings, to be comfortable. Because Tiberius is there, the man who may have destroyed his entire family. Caligula was sent to live in the emperor's villa on the island of Capri. It was there that he spent several years, constantly watching people who annoyed Tiberius, even a little bit, disappear. It was a place where torture and execution were part of the daily routine. Caligula saw it all with his own eyes, and realized, if you want to survive, don't feel sorry. Smile. He had learned from childhood that loved ones die and trust is weakness. His survival is not luck, it's strategy. He learned to be needed and invisible at the same time, and that mask stayed with him forever. Caligula learned to be silent, to hide his emotions, and to be what was wanted from him. He laughed when he had to laugh and bowed his head when obedience was demanded. But something dark was already brewing inside this child who had grown up amidst fear and death. And so when Emperor Tiberius died, under mysterious circumstances by the way, Caligula emerged from the shadows. The people greeted him as a hero, the son of the great Germanicus, the heir who would bring glory and justice back to Rome. Caligula became emperor. Rome rejoiced. The people celebrated, the senators smiled, and the soldiers shouted, "Long live the son of Germanicus!" People were sure that with his arrival a new, bright era would begin. He was young, handsome, popular. Most importantly, he was a living symbol of hope after the dark years of Tiberius's reign, and the first few months felt like a miracle. Caligula abolished the death penalty, released the unjustly convicted, forgave debts, organized lavish spectacles, games, and giveaways. The people felt it was the end of fear and the beginning of freedom. Even the Senate, usually cautious and spiteful, did not hide its joy. But 6 months later, something happened that changed everything. Caligula fell gravely ill. Contemporaries said he was on the verge of death, that it was fever, meningitis, or even poisoning. When he recovered, everyone rejoiced. But it quickly became clear. The emperor returned a different man. He began to suspect everyone. Executions began, one after another. First former friends, then senators, then even relatives. He executed one uncle for sneezing too loudly, another for allegedly dreaming of power in his sleep. Caligula required people to swear an oath of love. Those who refused would disappear. The disease could not just affect Caligula's health, but trigger a mental disorder that could not be diagnosed at the time, such as paranoia or megalomania. With each passing month, Caligula became more and more removed from reality. He was no longer just ruling. He was playing God. People who had recently seen him as a savior began to be afraid to even speak his name. He trusted no one. Not a friend, not his family, not his advisors. His word became law and his whims became a death sentence. But the main madness was yet to come. Caligula no longer saw the boundaries between play and power, between man and God. He began to do things that seemed impossible even for Rome, a city accustomed to everything. When Caligula began to call himself a god, no one was surprised. Too much had gone beyond common sense by then. He seriously considered himself Jupiter, the supreme god of the Roman pantheon. He ordered to build a bridge between his palace and the main temple to communicate with the gods directly, and then to be a god himself. He appeared in the images of different gods, then as Hercules, then as Apollo. He wore their robes, ordered statues with his face on them to be erected in temples, and replaced the heads of the real gods with his own. People who refused to worship him as a deity risked their lives. In 40 AD, Caligula was preparing to march on Britain. This was part of his ambitious plans to expand the Roman Empire. Britain was still unconquered at the time and was considered a wild and dangerous land full of warlike tribes. But its conquest promised the emperor fame and status comparable to Julius Caesar, who also once went there but did not gain a foothold. Caligula gathered an army, crossed Gaul, now modern France, and arrived at the shores of the English Channel. Soldiers were ready to invade and ships stood at the ready, but the invasion never happened. There are several versions of why the campaign was cancelled. Some historians believe that the soldiers refused to board the ships. The sea was rough, and Caligula himself had no military authority. Many officers and soldiers feared it was a pointless adventure. They were exhausted and saw no point in risking their lives for the whim of a mad emperor. In response to this humiliation, Caligula staged one of the most absurd scenes in Roman history. He ordered the soldiers to line up in battle order and attack the sea. The soldiers lined up as if for a real battle. The emperor gave the order to attack the waves. The Roman legionaries threw their spears into the sea, slammed their swords into the water. And then Caligula ordered them to collect seashells. He said, "These are trophies. We have conquered the ocean." He even brought these shells back to Rome as proof of his victory. For the people who once saw him as a hero, it was a real shock. But no one dared to contradict him. He was unpredictable, cruel, and dangerous. Some historians believe that Caligula deliberately staged absurd scenes to break the will of his subordinates and show that even in complete stupidity he would be obeyed. It was a psychological weapon. But the madness did not end there. After the war with the sea, no one tried to argue with the emperor. After all, every step could end in execution. His whims became more and more bizarre, his behavior more and more dangerous. But the most frightening thing wasn't his antics in public. It was what happened inside the palace. It was there that Caligula created his own cult centered around his family, and especially his sister. When Caligula started calling his sister goddess, no one knew whether it was still politics or nonsense. He made no secret of his love for her, not as a brother but as a woman. Sources say he lived with Drusilla as his wife. She was 2 years younger than he was, but he had a special affection for her from childhood. And when he became emperor, he made her the center of his life and his cult. He called her my light, my soul, and then the goddess Drusilla. The Senate was forced to say her name in prayers, and after her death in 38 AD, Caligula lost control of himself completely. He ordered her to be declared a goddess officially, built her a temple and an altar, and he executed anyone who didn't look like they were grieving enough, servants, officials, even friends. People in Rome began to fear not just his power, but his feelings, because Caligula began to believe that his family was not just family, but something sacred. He was transferring his divinity onto them. The other sisters, Agrippina and Julia, were also drawn into this cult. More than once he appeared with them at public events in provocative outfits. Caligula made no secret of the fact that the women in his family were, above all, the women of Rome. Inside the palace there was another strange trend. The emperor began to demand that high-ranking Romans gave him their wives and daughters, allegedly as a gift to the godlike ruler. He organized family banquets at which humiliating scenes involving women and the senators themselves took place. No one dared object, but if he turned even his dead sister into a goddess, what can we expect from a man who is increasingly out of touch with reality? Caligula's most famous subordinate was not a man, but a horse. His name was Incitatus, and he became a real symbol of the madness of the Roman emperor. But this is not just a joke or a fable. This is a real story, recorded by ancient authors. Caligula loved his horse so much that he allocated him a marble house. Not a stall, but a house with a garden, a fountain, and even a dining room. The horse was given servants, guards, and a golden harness. But the craziest part was his political career. Caligula announced that he was going to make Incitatus a consul, which is one of the highest positions in the Roman Empire. In fact, the second person after the emperor. Historians argue whether he really wanted to do it or was just mocking the Senate. But the meaning was clear to everyone. Caligula was showing that the horse is no worse than those who sit in the Senate chairs. Maybe even better, because he does not argue, does not betray, and does not ask unnecessary questions. Incitatus became a symbol of how far a man can go if he is allowed to do absolutely anything. Caligula no longer distinguished between power, a joke, and a threat. He played with Rome like a toy, and no one thought of stopping him. But even scarier was the way he began to play with people's lives. Caligula began turning spectacles, gladiatorial fights, theaters, races, into actual executions. For Caligula, spectacles became not entertainment, but a way to keep Rome in fear. He no longer just watched shows, he turned them into instruments of execution. If he got bored, he invented new, more brutal ways to entertain himself, whether it was a gladiator, a spectator, or a Roman aristocrat. The creepiest thing was that even the public was no longer safe. If something too boring was going on in the arena, Caligula would point to the spectators. Guards would grab random people from the crowd and throw them to the wild beasts. They could be old men, slaves, poor people, no one guilty of anything, just because he wanted a thrill. Gladiatorial games became torture in front of the whole crowd. Sometimes he'd stop a fight to personally tell them how to kill their opponent. And sometimes he gave life to the loser, but only if he begged on his knees or cried amusingly. Everything depended on his mood. Caligula's circus was not only an arena of fear, but also a mirror of his power. He ruled lives like a god, and death like a director. But for all these games, palaces, feasts, and senseless wars, there was a price to pay, and it wasn't his family or his cronies who paid, of course. It was the whole empire. Rome's coffers, full under Tiberius, began to empty rapidly under Caligula. Gifts to the crowds, luxuries, gold harness for the horse, personal amusements, all this cost a huge amount of money. When the money began to run out, Caligula didn't save money. He began to take it away. Taking. Squeeze. He made senators and rich people pay taxes for the honor of communicating with him in person. Those who refused would lose their property or their heads. He also confiscated inheritances, ruined families by accusing them of fictitious crimes just to get their lands and gold. He even sold seats in the courts and positions in the army. In other words, anyone with money could buy himself power, no matter if he was a traitor, a criminal, or just a buffoon. Caligula turned the state finances into his own piggy bank for fun. People feared for their money, lands, and lives. The empire was going downhill fast. The treasury was empty. The people were scared. The Senate was humiliated, and the soldiers were exhausted. Caligula no longer ruled Rome. He played with it like a toy. He spent millions, executed according to his mood, mocked the laws and the gods. But most importantly, he no longer trusted anyone, not even his cronies, his bodyguards, or his family. The emperor, who thought he was an immortal god, failed to see the simplest thing. Fear can unite even enemies. And deep within the palace, beneath the golden ceilings, a conspiracy began to brew. People who had been silent for years began to whisper, and those who had bowed before began to sharpen their blades. The Praetorians, the emperor's personal guards, played a key role in the plot. These soldiers were obliged to defend him to his last breath. But Caligula humiliated them, insulted them, and used them as servants. One of them, a senior officer named Cassius Herea, was particularly offended. The emperor openly mocked his voice, called him a wench, and gave orders in a mocking form. The conspiracy involved not only the military but also senators. They all realized that they could not wait any longer. Rome was no longer on the verge of chaos. It was in it. The decision to kill Caligula wasn't just revenge. It was a lifeline for the state. It all happened in January 41 AD during a theater performance in the palace. Caligula went backstage, at which point the conspirators surrounded him. Hereus struck first. He was followed by several others. According to various reports, the emperor received up to 30 dagger strokes. Caligula was killed not by his enemies, but by those closest to him. But even his death did not put an end to it. Caligula's blood cooled on the marble slabs of the palace, but the fear he left behind never disappeared. His body was secretly buried, without honor, without a coffin, under cover of night. People feared even a dead emperor. Caligula showed that power without control can turn even a young and charismatic man into a source of fear for millions. Almost 2,000 years have passed, and historians still argue, was he crazy? Or was it all a mask for the sake of absolute control? And what do you think about it? Write in the comments.